Welcome to You Make the Difference. I'm Wanda Walker, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Kevin Freeman. Dr. Freeman is with Grace Harbor, and it's a counseling agency, and he is very much involved in the trauma-informed community initiative that Judge Key is heading. And so we're so glad to have you.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about your role in bringing the trauma-focused community into play. And so let's just start off by saying, exactly is trauma? What are we trying to address?
Sure. Well, trauma is an event that looks different almost for each person, especially it looks different for a child versus an adult. But simply put, probably the best, most inclusive definition of trauma is that it's basically witnessing or experiencing some, some real or even perceived threat to a person's life or to their well-being.
Okay, and so I understand there are different types of trauma.
There's there's lots of different types of trauma, actually 6 that I'll kind of spotlight. But it's also important before we jump into types of trauma to see how prevalent it is. And according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, in the past year, they estimate that over 60% of children are actually going to experience some type of trauma event or abuse or violence in either their home or in their community. And so those statistics are pretty alarming. And so it's important to understand how prevalent it is before we kind of jump into looking at the different types.
Okay.
Now, go ahead.
All right, tell me what the types are.
There's more acute trauma, and acute trauma, it could be more of an isolated or single incident that happens just in a kind of a quick specified period of time. Children tend to be more resilient if there's a one-time trauma.
Yes.
Then we have more chronic trauma, and chronic trauma is just multiple events that can basically be cumulative in terms of how they respond and what the long-term and even short-term impact that's going to be.
So a cumulative might be where there is violence in the home and it's reoccurring and it just kind of adds up and adds up. Is that right?
It could be, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any type of trauma that continues to add up. When we start talking about more in-home trauma, we then start looking more at what's called complex trauma. And complex trauma is kind of the same thing. It's those chronic traumatic events that a child's been exposed to. But the thing about complex trauma is that typically it's by an adult or a person that they've trusted.
Yes.
And so it's even much more difficult to overcome that, and the impact is extremely difficult.
Yes, because it is very disturbing when you have someone in your family that is supposed to take care of you, such as your mama or your daddy, but they are doing things that cause you stress and make you feel unsafe.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it disrupts our whole, what we call cognitive schema of what the role of that person is. And we start seeing that those insecurities start infiltrating in almost all other areas of our life, whether it's the academic, the educational area, the social areas, as well as, of course, the emotional, and even some of the physiological areas that we'll talk about.
Yes, because in some homes, it almost seems like it's a war zone.
Absolutely.
Yes, and so and that is very traumatic,
Yeah.
and can cause very much stress for children as well as the adults.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Historical trauma is another type of trauma, and that basically could be a personal event or an historical event that just continues to kind of have an impact over generations. And it's important that as counselors that we assess for historical trauma, because then we can really get an understanding of how the family system, what role that plays and how intact it is, and how that trauma tends to recapitulate down generations. So it's important to understand that. Neglect is another form of trauma, and it's just as traumatic as violence in a way. And so we consider neglect a form of trauma, and that's one of the reasons that we have to work so hard with our foster care population at making sure that we're screening for traumas and we're addressing that.
Yes. So explain that a little bit. Like, what are you saying neglect is that is traumatic?
Neglect, not having some of your basic needs met. Could be something as simple as neglect. not having adequate food, shelter, having not having a stable home environment, and kind of having that sense of safety threatened.
Yes. Okay. All right. So what factors may influence a person's reaction to trauma?
Well, there's lots of different factors. Ultimately, what we look at as counselors is we look at what are your resilience factors and what are your strengths, because that ultimately is going to kind of gauge how you respond or you react to a traumatic. Age is very important. The developmental stage that a child particularly is in plays a large role. The perception of danger, whether they really perceived it as threatening or not, plays a big role. The relationship with the victim or the perpetrator will influence the reaction to trauma, whether they were a victim or a witness to something, because witnesses can experience almost just as significant trauma as victims.
Yes. Wow. So like if you're a child, you might view a traumatic experience differently than an adult. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Ultimately, your background and your brain structure, the intact cognitive structures, and we'll talk a little bit about exposure to early trauma on a physiological basis can really impact your brain in general, brain structure, brain development, brain growth, brain function, and that really does shape how you view the world, how you trust the world, how you attach to the world, and how you operate in the world.
Yes. And so let's talk about some of the signs of trauma.
Sure. Well, there's physical signs of trauma that we see, and those are the ones that, especially kids in general, they'll complain of nightmares, sleep terrors. You'll start noticing appetite issues or changes. Irritable bowel syndrome is a physical cue. And also some chronic pain complaints could also be a physical sign that there's some trauma stuff going on. Not always an indicator, but or indicates that trauma is occurring, but those are signs that when compiled together that you got to assess further.
Okay, and it also affects children in school, right?
Absolutely.
Tell me what some of those effects are.
Well, emotionally, it impacts children. We see that those children have high anxiety symptoms, high depressive symptoms. Behaviorally is really one of the ways that it comes out in school, with aggression, with refusing to cooperate. Hyperactivity is seen often and in high rates of children that were exposed to trauma. And just being hypervigilant in general with their surroundings. To understand the impact on the educational system, you really got to understand the impact on the brain.
Yes.
And the way that really is our brain is a very complex organization, as we all know. And there's three parts that predominantly work or overwork when children are exposed to trauma. We have this little almond-shaped structure in the middle of our brain called the amygdala, and it's our emotional regulation center. It's responsible for our fight or flight.
Yes.
The cortisol levels that are pumped. That's our stress hormone that are pumped out, getting us kind of hypervigilant and engaged. Then we have the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is basically our memory chip, in computer terms. It's our little typewriter, and it's basically what codes all of our memories. And so in children that's experienced trauma, what we see overactive amygdalas, which is overactive emotional reactivity,
yes,
and underactive hippocampus. And so what that says is that we are prone to memory problems, especially short term. And so a lot of our brain energy goes to our amygdala and not necessarily to our hippocampus. And that can set us up for educational issues.
So it affects how well we
remember
things.
And even to an extent of how well we learn.
Yes. And so it affects our retaining of information, is that right?
Absolutely. And recent research has even said it affects our ability to control some of our impulses, which says that if we have an overactive amygdala, that our hippocampus is underactive, and that's our memory chip,
yes,
and our prefrontal cortex, which is developing until our early 20s, basically is much smaller. and when they compared brain scans to those children that they knew were traumatized versus not.
Okay, now there's some help. And so talk about what help is available, the kinds of treatments for children and adults really too who've been traumatized.
Sure. There's different types of therapeutic modalities that counselors and often psychologists and psychiatrists will use. Different types of therapies, exposure therapies, those are more on the trauma focus, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's some other cognitive therapies that work. EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Yes.
And that basically, a lot of these are those therapies that really work on the brain and helping us reprocess and move past. It's important that as a counselor, when we sit down with somebody that we know has experienced trauma, is that we don't jump into the trauma immediately. There's kind of a sequence of events that we have to take place. We have to first assess their coping skills.
Yes.
And make sure, and in most cases, help them build coping skills. And make sure that all those skills are intact, because they're going to be able to need to use those, whether it's mindfulness, deep breathing, cognitive reframing. They're going to be able to need to use those when we move on to revisiting that trauma. And revisiting the trauma allows us to hopefully, and in the last phase of therapy, reprocess the trauma to where when it is recalled or it is triggered in the future, it's not triggered with all those emotions
Yes.
that it was stored with. And the amygdala helps all those emotions kind of link those to the hippocampus.
So tell me, I don't know if this is making it too simple, but tell me how you do that, how you can bring healing in such a way that when somebody thinks about that trauma, that the emotions aren't there anymore.
Sure. Well, it's important, just like you said, our brain tends to store information linked with the emotions that we felt at the time.
Yes.
And so that's one of the reasons why when folks, especially adolescents or youth, are cued with the trauma, that they have such an adverse reaction to it. Is because they, at that point, even adults today,
Yes.
re-experience all those emotions. And so it's important to develop those coping skills, to build a rapport that's trusting, and then and exercise those coping skills to where they know they can de-escalate, they know that they're in control, they know that they're going to be okay to revisit the trauma, and then we move into revisiting. And that's some of the therapeutic techniques is trauma narratives, reframing the trauma in a different way. And ideally, when we do that, what happens in the brain is that we start seeing that the brain starts kind of restoring information that's based on the trauma narrative or based on the reprocessing, and we don't necessarily experience all those negative emotions, so we process through them.
Yes.
And it depends on which technique you use.
Yeah, there are a lot of techniques,
There
right?
are a lot of techniques.
Yeah, and I remember one time somebody helped me do that, and it was like, I was a child when something happened, and so they asked me, well, I'll just tell you what it was. My daddy drank, and so we sometimes left home and those kinds of things, and so one time my mama went back into the household when Daddy was still drinking and those kinds of things, or we were in there, and not leaving. And so the person said, "Why do you think your mama was feeling okay to go back in?" And and my first response was, "I don't know. I don't know why she felt comfortable." But it did start helping me reprocess that, I was a child and maybe it wasn't quite as dangerous as I viewed that it was.
Sure.
And so it helps you make peace a little bit with
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, by the
Yeah.
way. And so changing your perception of that event really helped you at kind of resolving some of those emotions tied to that memory.
that. Yes. Yeah, and I still don't quite thoroughly understand it, but it did start that thinking process.
Absolutely.
And so I assume that's some of the things that you might do in counseling.
Sure.
Yes. Okay, so we've heard a lot in the media about post-traumatic stress disorder.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah.
And that's with the veterans, where they have been in dangerous situations, and then even though they're back in the United States and safe, they may feel again those intense feelings. Talk about that a little bit, and let me know whether people who've gone through traumatic situations are prone to that,
Yeah.
or that can be avoided, or
Sure. PTSD is big now, especially with a lot of folks coming home from our war zones. Not all trauma manifests into PTSD. PTSD is basically a more complex and chronic degree of trauma that's been experienced, that really not only that the trauma event tends to be accompanied with repeated re-experiencing or intrusive thoughts, and then that comes with some type of avoidant behavior, and whatever that looks like, to where they want to avoid those memories or avoid certain situations. There's usually negative alterations in mood, and then PTSD really comes with increased arousal symptoms.
Yes.
And that could be just being extremely hypervigilant, and so PTSD is different than trauma. Trauma usually precedes PTSD in a lot of cases, but our children are more at risk of PTSD if it's a repeated trauma.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, what are the consequences of unresolved trauma?
Well, and we see those, and being a counselor, we see those every day. If trauma is not resolved, we see a lot of those manifest into addictive misbehaviors or addictive disorders. We see folks with very poor abilities to resolve conflict.
Yes.
And that can lead to aggression, and it can lead to basically not being aggressive enough in certain situations.
Fear.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Lots paralyzed with fear. Low self-esteem, low self-confidence are some issues that kind of come. Suicidal thoughts. Attachment patterns is another thing that we see. And attachment patterns is where they can have either there's too standoffish for attachments of friends or relationships, or that they have a tendency to over-attach too fast. And so we really see disorganized relationship patterns, eating disorders, depression, self-harm, self-mutilation. Those are all some things that tend to come out if when trauma is not resolved. So as therapists, one of the things that's critical that we all do is to screen for trauma early.
Yes, and you want to talk about some of the screening techniques?
Absolutely. There's hundreds of screening tools out there. There's one that I particularly like is the trauma screening questionnaire. There's an open-ended question that I've asked kids for years, and it's, has there anything that's happened that shouldn't have happened in your life? And that tends to spark a conversation I'm not very specific, but yet I come from, they're able to give me an answer from their perception.
Yes.
And remember that trauma is largely shaped by your perception of an event. And so things that I wouldn't have in the past have maybe even thought of as traumatic, I've had some kids who really see that as trauma. And so being able to understand that allows me to be able to help them.
Yes, and so some of it has to do with your personality, right?
Yeah. Talk to me more about what you're saying.
Okay, so like if my personality is one that I have a lot of fear and those kinds of things, I might see a situation happen in a restaurant that somebody that doesn't have that fear would not think anything was going on, and maybe the person who was engaged in that activity was not meaning to be overbearing or aggressive, or it was their personality. And so because of how I am made and think, then, and I don't know if that's personality.
It is how you interpreted that.
How I interpreted that could make it traumatic for me, where it was just a person expressing their strong feelings and not being aggressive at all.
Sure. It sounds a little bit like what we talked about, hypervigilance.
Yes.
Is that, and you're right, victims of trauma do tend to become hypervigilant. their personality structure can be altered in a lot of different ways, or impacted based on their relationship with their caregiver, whether that's their parent or another caregiver. And we're really seeing that now as we understand more and more about personality disorders.
Yes.
We're seeing that trauma plays a large role. Trauma and especially in the form of attachment issues, plays a large role at predisposing and kind of cascading personality disorders that we see in adulthood. There's more research to come on that, but we're excited just to see that there is likely a correlation there.
Yes. All right. So, tell me about secondary trauma.
Secondary trauma. It's really popular. Secondary trauma is really popular, or more influential in folks that work with trauma victims. And because every day you're hearing this, and it's counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, some school counselors, pastors
Yeah.
especially are all prone to secondary trauma because, day in and day out you're hearing all of this trauma, you're hearing all of this kind of negative, sometimes horrific things that are happening. And so what happens is over time you start to experience a lot of those same negative aspects of trauma, when you could have some depression, you could not be able to turn it off, in terms of when you leave your job, you could worry about some of those clients, and there's all kind of ways that it can manifest your life. You could experience the emotional symptoms just as much as they could. So it's important that to combat that you have a strong network of support, especially peers. Counselors are encouraged to continue supervision for that reason if you work with those high-risk population groups.
Yes.
And to some degree, I remember I experienced that same thing a year after I graduated from my master's program. Is I was working with a lot of high-risk kids through the Department of Children and Family Services that were neglected and abused, and I kind of noticed that something's changed.
Yes.
There's a lot of anxiety. I'm not able to sleep through the night without worrying about someone, and so part of SALT supervision was able to use some techniques and really work through that.
Yes, and there's going to be a training in LaGrange, or a workshop for people who may have been experienced a secondary trauma, and you're going to be a speaker there, and so that's really good. And
Sure.
I've heard that there are about 125 people who have already signed up to come,
Oh,
so
wow.
it should be a great
Yeah.
time for people to learn about secondary trauma and also what they can do about it. And so now, I know statewide there is a push to have trauma-informed communities, and they have really kind of wanted us to work with foster care children and children who are going through the juvenile justice system. Why should we be concerned about the juvenile informed care, and what are some of the benefits?
Well, we have to be concerned because we're seeing increased number of kids who are being exposed to the foster care. In terms of that entering that population, we're seeing increased number of kids involved in the juvenile justice population, and even as counselors, we're seeing increased number of kids with mental health symptoms. And so, one of the precursors to that is that we tend to see that trauma underlies a lot of those issues.
Yes.
Excuse me, and how those present. And so it's important for as clinicians to not only be informed that trauma has the potential of underlying all these issues, but screening for it. And then there's, I guess, a trauma-informed system would encompass the whole community.
Yes.
That would basically be responsible for screening for trauma anytime you come into contact with a potential client, whether that's in the school system, whether that's at a fire station,
Yes.
at a police station. And so if we screen and then we notice that, okay, there's something else going on here, that we need to recommend a more in-depth trauma assessment in which a mental health professional would perform a comprehensive assessment with some more detailed trauma screening tools in hopes of generating some recommendations that would help that person move through or resolve that trauma.
Yes.
So they don't keep recapitulating down that family of origin.
Yes, and so it's it's very important for the whole community to be sensitive to this issue and also knowledgeable about this issue, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is.
Yes. Now, so you're on the committee that Judge Key has set up
Yes.
to bring this to our community. Tell me what some of the things you will be doing.
Well, from my understanding, there's 3 committees, and those committees are tasked with, one committee's tasked with just increasing awareness of trauma issues in general. Another committee is tasked with helping the stakeholders increase their understanding of trauma on a systems level.
Yes.
And then the last committee that I believe is an outcomes committee, and I serve on that committee. But it's looking at what are the measurable outcomes. So, as a community, how do we know we're meeting the needs in terms of trauma-informed care? Are we screening for it? And what's the impact to the community and what's the impact to the consumer?
Yes. Now, you're with Grace Harbor, and Grace Harbor is located in Newnan,
Yes.
but you have also hired 3 counselors to come into the LaGrange area to offer services for people who have experienced trauma.
Absolutely.
And I just want to say that we are really thankful that you have done that. And I know, you are going to add to your staff other than that as the need arises.
Sure.
So it is, and you already have experience in giving care to children who are in foster care and in the juvenile court system in other places, and so we have somebody here who's experienced. And I know also one of your desires is to help other people who are not Grace Harbor
Sure.
employees, other counselors, learn these techniques and be able to give those to people who need them. And so I just want to say thank you for what you're doing, and that you're truly making a difference in our community, even though you live in Coweta County. But we appreciate what you're doing.
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for watching You Make the Difference, and to remind you that what you do truly makes a difference. And we'll see you next week.
Got a promise from heaven. It's a year of replevin. Got a promise from heaven.